Sarah, Natalie, welcome to the show. Welcome to Talking Insights. Thank you so much for your time and congrats on the awards. Congrats for being here and congrats on the projects.
Thank you.
Your project, it's a very interesting one in the sense of traditional research. Sometimes, I know that sometimes struggles with when doing research in some types of topics. And when it's chronic conditions, these types of topics sometimes are very challenging when doing research. Can you tell me more about the project that you created and what challenges did you encounter when creating the whole project?
So our project, well, it was part of a broader project. So we had the organisation that I work for, CF Together, had received government funding to support young people who are transitioning from paediatric care to adult care and to support them through their teenage journey whilst living with a chronic condition. And at the end of the project, we obviously need to do an evaluation, which is when we engaged with Natalie to support us with the evaluation. We had done a number of evaluations with young people over the years, but we had always struggled to really engage with them through the evaluation process in a meaningful way. So when we would reach out to young people and say, hey, do you want to answer some questions and do some research via Zoom or whatever it might be, they were just completely disinterested, understandably, because, you've gone through years of COVID, having to talk to teachers on Zoom and all of those sorts of things. So Natalie and I spoke together about how we could potentially engage young people through using social media. And Nat really had the idea to open it up and ask them how they would like to be engaged with in order to answer some of the questions that we were looking for. I'll throw it to you, Nat.
Yeah, so I think, coming into the project, I'm a health practitioner as well. And in Australia, I hold a registration which holds me accountable to a professional code of conduct and a code of ethics, meaning that no matter what I do or whatever research I do, participants can almost report me against a best practice, And so I take that really seriously in every single role I do, no matter what type of research I'm engaged with. I'm predominantly a community engaged research, which means my specialization is how do we speak deeply with community? How do we elevate their thoughts, their feelings, their experiences? And I've worked across different ranges of research, whether it's design research, more health social focused service design, and also starting to look at clinical, non-clinical, academic, non-academic. So I've got a lot of exposure in different type of approaches, making sure that research is ethical and best practice when we're engaging with people. And so I guess my benefit when I looked at this body of work was I remember saying to Sarah, I'm a consultant into this work. I don't work for your organization. And now where that gets a little bit exciting is I can hold a bit of risk. So if anything goes wrong, you can go, oh, that bloody consultant who came and did that, that's not our fault. So I said, why don't we have a bit of fun here, right? It's a small enough project that we can almost pilot a new approach and limit the amount of risk. And our first step is asking, how do they want to engage? And so when we went to them and said, how do you want to engage for this body of research? It was overwhelming that they said Snapchat. At that point in time, I had to take, I guess, almost my best practice and my principles and approaches and all about data privacy and integrity and go, how on earth is this going to look?
Was it difficult to move from the traditional way of as you were saying, using Zoom or using this video calls to make this research to move it to Snapchat, like the technical part? How did you design this approach? Not only to be easier for you, but also for whoever's answering the questions to be in a safe and friendly way.
Yeah, it wasn't easy for me, but I come from a background of doing complex, highly sensitive research. I'm very, very used to working deep in community and working with people who are living with some serious challenges. So, to put my brain in a space to go, how do we do this? So it's always preference that they're comfortable, not me. And that's probably the key thing. This research was not comfortable for me as a researcher. It was highly challenging to do. I worked outside of many hours. Originally it was like, I'm going to engage with them in Snapchat. It's going to be over an hour. So, from 6 till 7, they had choice whether they wanted to share it through text, video or audio based on where they wanted to engage. So that felt pretty doable. But what came up really quickly was that didn't work because they didn't want to sit on a device for an hour just going back and forth with chat. They wanted to spread that research over maybe 1 to 2 weeks And it might have been 5 minutes, 9 a.m. Monday, 5 minutes, 6 p.m. Friday. So I was pretty much on call, but I was really happy to play with that to see what outcomes we would get. And the outcomes were epic. I had a kid messaging me 10 minutes before their shift. They'd just gone from high school to secondary school and they were about to do their, casual job. And they messaged me going, "Oh, I've got 10 minutes spare. Happy to have a chat now." And, obviously then it's like, so you don't want to do video, you want to do text, right? Because please don't send me a video to watch in public. Really amazing how they managed the research around their time. And in addition to that, we're talking about young people living with chronic illness, so it's around medical appointments, school, sport, physical exercise, and also feeling unwell. I had a participant say, "I'm not feeling okay at the moment." And I was like, "Cool. When you feel better, get back to me." And I thought, no way they're getting back to me.
Yeah.
And they did. And they were ready to chat.
Wow. And that's very interesting, that feeling safe part. Was it difficult to manage the security? Because at the end of the day, you're just using a tool like a Snapchat. Was it difficult to manage the whole security of the data and also the integrity of said data?
Yeah, so look, integrity of data is really important to me because specifically I work with community and it's about how do I gather their stories and how do I keep those stories true. So from the process of gathering it to what I spit out on the other side. So Snapchat has a feature where things disappear, right? So the first thing was to overcome, how am I going to gather this data so it doesn't disappear? Thankfully, they've got a little button that you can press that it doesn't disappear till after 24 hours. So it was a toggle. So I did that and I didn't know how to do that. I actually had my own teenagers help me to set that up. And so that meant I had 24 hours to get data, but I still had to extract it pretty quickly. So the second part was, how am I going to get it off a phone? Because that was the way you engage through Snapchat, onto my desktop and onto the research platform that I use. Thankfully, I'm an Apple user, and I don't know if you're an Apple user, but you can copy and paste and send things pretty seamlessly from one device to the other. So the minute they sent me something, it was my responsibility to get that data as quick as possible and put it in my research platform. We didn't have any overarching issues around where data was stored because there was no engagement, for example, with commercial or government. It was with CF Together. So there wasn't any policy around the data has to be stored here. So that wasn't a huge barrier. But then obviously the concern was, well, the data they share with us, who then has access to that data? And look, based on, the Snapchat information they share, is that they don't keep anything like the actual content of a private message. They keep metadata like the time and sender ID, but they don't actually keep the message content. And they don't use any private message data for IO training, advertising, or analytics. So, and they save only that really overarching data. So they're not sharing the human data stuff at all. That's what they say. And obviously it's being transparent with the young people through that consent process that it is Snapchat, what's going to happen on Snapchat and what does it look like? And do we have full consent with that process?
We
I think
actually,
I think this
sorry, before you jump into the next thing, at the very start of the process, we also engaged with, if they were under 18, we obviously engaged with their parents and had full written approval from their parents before we started engaging directly with the young people.
Right. I think it's very interesting the way that you did this research and you created this project. And it's very inspiring. It's something that I hope that anyone that's listening can. Obviously, we always want that inspire people when creating these episodes and creating this show. But I really feel like these types of projects, they are so difficult to create, I feel like, or so innovative in a way, can bring some inspiration for everyone that's listening. With that said, were there any unexpected challenges during the project that just completely took you off the ground, and or learnings that you had with those challenges?
Yeah, there'd be two different challenges. I know from a stakeholder perspective or my client's perspective in the past, it is how do we get this through approval of our team? So CF Together run clinical services, and I'll get Sarah to talk directly more to that. So obviously then there's concerns of like, who is this person? How are they doing it? What if that person shares something that shows they're at risk? What if they start sharing sensitive health data? Or what if they, need to be triaged? What if they start talking about, mental health impact of the chronic illness condition? So I think it's probably helpful for the client, because this has come up many times. I often can't do anything innovative if the client doesn't get an internal approval. But once I've got the internal approval, if there's good collaboration, we can work through some of these challenges. But I think it might be helpful for some of the listeners to hear how Sarah may have navigated the internal decision-making process to be able to take this approach.
Yeah. Oh, well, I think I was pretty lucky actually in that in the way in which we wish to engage with young people living with cystic fibrosis or rare diseases, we like to think of ourselves as being quite innovative, and we like to think that we can try different things so we can meet young people where they're at. We understand that we can't effectively engage with and support them if we're not meeting them where they are, because quite often at that age, they don't want to associate with having a chronic condition, so they don't want to engage with us if we're not doing it in the appropriate way. So the organisation as a whole is quite open to different ways of doing things. And I think initially when Natalie and I first sat down, it took quite a few conversations between the two of us just to figure out how it could potentially work. Even just conversations around the nuances around language and how we talk to young people and what we tend to say when we're, going through services with them and supporting them, and what we tend not to say. We tend to use the word condition and not disease, and all the tiny little nuances that need to come into play when we're kind of handing that trust and relationship building over to an external provider. But we did work very closely through the whole process. So we got to a point where we felt quite comfortable. Lily had written up a lot of the questions that she was asking. I had looked through them. Of course, you can't control that, because then the kids come back and ask different questions, and she needs to go through the process of being organically open with them. But we did work very closely and collaboratively together across that.
Yeah. And I think, there was also really clear containers of what it was being used for. Before the research was set up, the participants, knew that we're setting up a CF Together account on Snapchat. They knew what that account was for. They knew it was only temporary. They knew it wasn't, we set some guidelines, it's not to ask clinical questions. It is a researcher. And then I almost had some guidelines myself to go, okay, if they ask this, I know that CF Together has support that I can refer them to, and it's not me giving that to them. And I think the other piece of mind is I am a health professional as well, which means that if things can come up, it is within my scope to be able to understand what is the best practice at that point in time and where I refer them. And I think that's helpful. That's almost like, a very wonderful convenience that I'm doing this type of research, but I hold that health professional registration. I'm keen to throw back it to you, Antonio, because I hear so often that it is challenging. I can't understand why there is so much of a reputation that doing research like this is challenging. It feels very organic to my approach. And I don't know whether I'm a little bit of a cowboy or rebellious. I probably am. I probably have that rep. But I hear it a lot, and I'm more interested for people to think, what is that barrier?
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and I think sometimes it's to use a new type of technology, to use a new app, to use anything different that they're not used to do. I think sometimes it's just a barrier to when creating these types of projects or creating research. I think that's what I mean. And sometimes I feel like, at least from previous episodes and from previous conversations, I feel like sometimes there's a bit of, I don't want to call it a fear, but a step back on, innovating and trying new ways to do research, because, you're used to do like this and this boxes and put it things this way. And sometimes it's difficult to just step out of the box and try to use Snapchat for research, or try to use a different tool. And especially nowadays, I feel like everyone's talking about like AI and internet and all of these things that are trying to, be these big catchwords, and people trying to focus more on that. And sometimes the answer, it's right in front of you. It's something that you're using day to day, some app or some, service that you're already using it for something else. And maybe you should just look at on some other perspective, on some other lenses, and maybe there's something that you use on your day-to-day that you can use on your research. And that kind of leads me to my final question, which was some advice for the researchers. Because the way that you did, the transparency that you did, I think that's something that obviously you needed for this type of research. Is there any other advice for the researchers that are listening when creating their work and their projects?
I think we're always an advocate, and it really depends on what type of research you do. But if you're doing research that's to elevate human experience, doesn't matter if it's commercial, it doesn't matter if it's for government, you are almost the holder of that story. And I think zooming out research is about sharing knowledge, it's about sharing story, and we have to share the true story because people do read our research. They do listen and look at that research, and they do make decisions based on the research we do. And some of those decisions are, huge levers for social change. So we have to hold that accountability and responsibility. It doesn't matter how big or small that project is. So then when we get invited to go, we want to do this type of research, is to really hold that responsibility true and set the work up from the beginning properly. And so often we're challenged not to speak up with clients because we're worried that we're going to look dumb or we're not experts or we can't question the way things are. But there's a very delicate, balance to going, okay, great, that's the outcome you want. However, there is a genuine responsibility when I'm gathering this data. And have you thought of, or should we, or can we do it like this? And every client that I have is at a different level of maturity. They might be like, see if together we're like, hell yes, let's do this. Or they might be like, hell no. But it's almost our role to re-educate those that we work with, how important it is to get this right and how important it is to be able to speak to people with true depth and true relationship. Because if we're only uncovering superficial data and insights, that's really concerning when people are relying on our research to make decisions about our world and our communities. So it's difficult, and sometimes, especially if you're in commercial or design research, you get stuck, even market research. But even market research, people are engaging with businesses every second of their day. So if businesses can take real human insight to change things just a little bit to make someone's day better or easier or more accessible or inclusive, ultimately, I hand on heart believe that's how we start creating worlds where everyone feels like they fit in and we've got true representation of the human experience. So my advice to researchers, if you are a researcher, to ignite that passion and that responsibility that we all have, whether you're quant or qual or commercial, academic, whatever, and just think about how can I keep this data as true as possible? And if I am that person responsible to collect that data, how am I going to represent that properly on the other side?
Well, I have no notes. I think it's a great advice. Natalie, Sarah, I think it's a great conversation, and I thank you so much for your time. Congratulations again on the awards. And that's all for today, folks. Talking Insights is a production of Research World and SMR, bringing you the stories, voices, and ideas shaping the insights community around the world. If you'd like to be featured in a future episode, share your story, or learn more about sponsoring opportunities, send us an email at podcast@smr.org. And don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. And join us next week for another great conversation. See ya.